We have one more week in God's kitchen, but this is my last chance to give you the kitchen theme. This whole series comes from about 8 years ago, another church, another place where we gathered some ideas, and they had some different ideas. So when Lynn and Kelsey and Kathy and Brooke, when they picked their favorite connections to a kitchen, they added a lot of their own themes like banquet table and fountain of faith. That one was totally new. But fruit salad, I preached about the same fruit salad in this same series 8 years ago, back 2017. Preached on joy and patience and peace and kindness, generosity, trust, gentleness, self-control. And anytime that I do go back and preach on the same scripture, I'll go back and look at my notes and say, what did I say then? Fix anything I think I said wrong back then, which is common. Maybe bring a little something fresh to it. I went back and looked at that week, and it was a heavy week back in 2017. These stoles, some of you remember that when a preacher puts this on, it is sort of taking on the weight of a whole community, whether it's your pain, your grief, your doubt, and kind of putting that on shoulders. And some weeks that's heavier than others. See, back then in 17, my preaching professor from a couple decades before, his name was Burns Stanfield. It's a great name, Burns Stanfield. His father had been a Presbyterian preacher, and his father had been a Presbyterian preacher, and his father had been a Presbyterian preacher. So when Burns was young, he said, no way. And so when he decided, what's the farthest thing I can do from being a Presbyterian preacher, he decided to go join a punk rock band, and he was the drummer and the piano player for Scruffy the Cat. Probably none of you have ever heard of Scruffy the Cat. They do have videos on MTV, which is pretty far from what I do. I do have videos of myself on VH1, but you would have to search really hard to find those, and I wasn't doing music. God can show up in good music or bad reality TV. God shows up wherever. But Burns, he tried to get away, and he had this great band, and he got really good at just playing the crowd. So when God dragged him back to church, kicking and screaming, he did a pretty good job with the music. He ended up at a little bitty church in South Boston, not First Presbyterian, not Second Presbyterian, Fourth Presbyterian church. It was the fourth one in this little town. Little white clapboard church just down the road. If you've seen Good Will Hunting, when they do the overviews there, it's just a few blocks away. Just down the road from there in this little church, the area around it was full of disillusioned Catholics, people who'd grown up Catholic, and some of you, and they just weren't that way. So they would say, Father Burns, how you doing? And they'd make him their own. He was the father of the place. And there were a ton of immigrants from Thailand. For whatever reason, this happened, little clusters. And so this whole cluster of Thai immigrants, the parents, none of them spoke English. And so the 8 and the 10 and the 12-year-old kids would be the translators for everything. Whenever the governor came to the church to talk about low-income health care, the 8 and the 10 and the 12-year-olds would do the translation. And who knows what they really said to their parents? Who knows how close it was? That neighborhood, there were a lot of African-American families, and they would send their preteens, a lot of 12-year-olds, they would say, go to youth group, go over there, and it was their way to keep them out of the gangs, and sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. And amongst that congregation, there were also about a dozen professors, because the red line went from Cambridge right down to Southie. And so if you were a professor at BU or at Harvard, you'd go down to this church. A holy mess, just a total mess of a church. As the sanctuary was half the size of ours, just as many people jammed in there, noise all the time, and Burns was the perfect punk rock star for a church like that. He still is. He's still doing that. God bless him. That church, Fourth Pres, never even remotely met its bills for their stewardship campaign. They would do their stewardship not even get close. I don't know, their Presbyterian exec, I don't know what they did to make it work, but it never worked. And yet they were committed to serving their community. So even though they never once got close to paying their bills, they bought the building behind them to be an after-school sanctuary and a summer meals program for the kids of the neighborhood. So eventually 100 kids a day would come into this place and get fed when they were always on the verge of turning off lights in their church. I told you they made an outsized effort to help the low income in Massachusetts by bringing the governor in. The fellowship hall, this church is so small that you would go that way to go to a bathroom. Their bathroom door was behind the pulpit. Like to go to the fellowship hall, you had to walk this close, and Burns would just hi, good, yeah, have at it there, and we know where you're going. It wouldn't miss a beat. It was the kind of church that just gathered this spirit. One day, their seminary intern, so he was still in seminary, younger than Kelsey. He had only preached like 3 times in the church, and so his graduation kind of sermon was coming up, and he's getting ready for it, and he's getting ready, and he looks out, and sometimes people come in a little after the 10 o'clock here, we notice, and there at 10:02, Jesse Jackson walked through the door, and this intern was like, oh boy, I can't rewrite my sermon now. So this is the kind of church I'm telling you about. Burns taught me preaching because he taught at Harvard, and he taught music, worship, leadership at another seminary, and there is no way that he could do it all. But behind every good man is, that's right, a great woman. The last time I preached about the fruit of the Spirit, when I went back to look at my notes in this In God's Kitchen series, was the week that Burns' wife finally died from cancer, age 56. And Lorraine, if I've given you the highlight of Burns' life, Lorraine did her undergrad at Princeton. She did her medical degree at Harvard. She did her residency at Brown. Kind of a big deal. And as rock stars will do, when you have a resume like that, you know your first job is going to be huge. You know your career is shooting off. Her first job was to go run this busy, serve for years in Africa, in Western Africa. And she came back to America to run a little urban clinic in Southie where she met a punk rock preacher, and they got married and had 2 kids. And on the side for her, she taught med students how to do small community development, how to build clinics in small communities. So Burns was a model for people like me. Lorraine was a saint for everybody to look up to. And when she finally gave in to cancer 8 years ago, the very week that I was supposed to preach about joy, that very week, Burns posted on his Facebook for his thousands of followers. He posted 2 pictures, one from their wedding dance, that time of the dance when you're through the biggest stress and all you can do is look at each other's eyes in bliss. That was on one side, and the other picture was from that week when she had finished hospice. They told her she was done, and they stood up and danced again with the tubes in her nose, and they looked with the same smile somehow. Such a hard-earned smile. To see the capacity for joy in those kind of times is an inspiration. I don't know how you grow fruit like that kind of joy, to be able to smile at each other in so much pain and loss. That very same week, 8 years ago, the very week I was supposed to talk about peace, Mary said goodbye to Jack. Jack was one of the old pillars of that church. He was about 6'3" and 85 years old, but fitness of a 60-year-old. He had a big Adam's apple and a deep voice. He was an engineer, and he would carry sharpened pencils, like not mechanical pencils. He would carry sharpened pencils. Phil's got it right there, yeah. And he was just that kind of a guy. Even though as stern as he looked, when he would laugh, it would almost have like a high-pitched giggle to it that you didn't expect. Mary she was just in everything in that church. She was in the sewing group, and she ran the kitchen, and she did this and that. They had been in a church of mine years before, but I got closer to them again because the year before, in my Colorado mountain town, we had a major wildfire, big wildfire, and my house was about a half mile from the epicenter of that, so I was evacuated for many days while the awesome wildland firefighters did their job. We have a picture of like one of those planes coming down, right down our valley, spitting out the thing just like Paul does. It's one of the coolest pictures I'll ever see because I'm like, I know that mountain. I look at that mountain. So they did their job. I did my job. Long days at the Red Cross Help Center, 14, 16 hours a day. I did not dare think about what was going on at my house if it was still there. And I would go back eventually to the little cabin that Jack and Mary gave me to rest. They lived in Boulder. They had a cabin. The shower didn't even work. They just used it in the summer to play with their grandkids. But they let me stay there and have a place, a refuge of peace while the world literally burned down around us. And Jack was laid to rest 8 years ago on a Saturday, right before I had written my sermon on Wednesday, and then it was like Saturday, so I ripped it all up and just started fresh. These things happen in threes, right? So that very same week that I was supposed to talk about patience and kindness and generosity, it sometimes takes patience to go visit people in a hospital. Some of you who've been preachers know what this is like, that you have to take that big breath. You take the big breath in your car when you have the parking spot that says clergy, so you get a little closer walk, and then you take another breath before you walk into the hospital room, so you're your best self. And I would go visit Frank. Frank was a big, strong man until these months. He became so weak after a stroke. Then they told him he had cancer. They sent him home. He had a heart attack, came back in. He'd grown so weak. And it took some patience because his wife, Susan, love her to death. One of my favorite people I've ever shared a church with. But she was so anxious, as you would be if your partner is lying right there. And her main way of coping all through the week, all through her life, was to complain about politics. Now, that could be fun, but I didn't think it was my job at the time to egg her on with some of the things she would say. Frank and Susan came to every Bible study, even though they did not ever believe in God. Frank said he got close once, but mostly he came to church because he was inspired by other people who believed. They came to every book club. At every book club, no matter what the topic, Frank would have a show tune, like a Broadway musical song that he would be able to just sing a line to. I know that men of that generation watched a lot of Broadway and things, and it was incredible what he could do in his mind there. Of course, they served on session. They were the proverbial pillars of that little church in Colorado. It took some patience to watch him decline for a couple of months, but this very week, when I was supposed to preach about patience, it was the time I went in his room with the hospice nurse and his wife, and the nurse said it in the kind of straightforward, heavy language that is absolutely intimidating to everyone in the world except for hospice nurses. And she just said, "Frank, we're taking you off of treatment. We're moving you to comfort care, and you will be dead tomorrow or the next day." Just straight. And Frank started to reach for his wife's hand and sing a Broadway show tune. And it was the most beautiful thing I've ever seen in my life. Just the way they held on to each other and sang about a tear in a glass. And I had the patience to be able to see something truly, truly sublime. Leaving Frank's room, we sat in the hallway. Susan, she told me, actually, to push away from the grief she was kind of meeting, she told me about she'd been mean to the nurses. She was mean to everybody. It wasn't like a weird thing. She was mean. So she said, I should have been nicer to the nurses. I should have been nicer. And it just so happened that a month ago we had a Bible study where we talked about the difference between nice and kind. And so I reminded Susan that the root of the word nice comes from the Latin word ignorant, and the root of the word kind comes from the same word as kin. So to be kind is to treat someone like family. And she said, "So I should treat the nurses like family?" And I said, "Yeah, and that means you got to give your real self to them. But forgive when you can forgive. I should treat the nurses like family. Well, then they can go to hell just like my brother." And that's what she said. And she laughed like you, and she cried, and her little shoulders, little skinny shoulders shook. And she laughed and she cried. You couldn't quite know which was which. And the next day she brought flowers and she brought a card for all the staff as she sat with her husband until he died. Because kindness won, even in the face of such loss. Other translations put the next word on this list as goodness, maybe your Bible, but the NRSV, it says generous. And all of these couples who became these important models, they were all, quite older than me, and they became important models for how to be in relationship right to the end. They were so generous with their time, with their witness, with just being able to invite me into their lives. And like the best gifts we ever get, their generosity was weightier than I ever realized at the time. Many of you have given each other those kinds of gifts in this church and to each other. And I hope it's kind of a miracle when we can realize just how important our neighbor is to us and what they've given to us and what we've given to each other. It can build so much trust together. I told you last week, I'm impressed. I'm proud of this church. I'm moved by the commitment and trust. We need each other so often in this world. Sometimes I need to borrow your faith. Sometimes when you don't believe, you need your neighbor to believe for you. Sometimes when you don't feel like you can sing a hymn, you need to hear someone else's voice. Sometimes when you've cried enough and you don't want to pray again because you don't trust it, you can see someone else trust it deeply, and you just follow their lead. And so for a lot of you, you follow their lead, your model of faith. It might come from someone here. It might come from your grandma. It might come from your old Sunday school teacher. It might come from some saint you know from the past, or from a Bible figure like Paul. Paul inspired so much of the New Testament, and he gets plenty of criticism for good reason. But there's something I like about the guy, is he starts off so elite. He's just so comfortable with violence and being better than each other. He's so comfortable with his pursuit of purity. He starts that way, but once he starts to follow a path of Jesus, no longer is he a fancy lawyer. He's just a craftsman who builds tents. No longer is he a worshiper of strength. Now he admits weakness. No more does he demand everyone to be right around him. He asks for gentleness. And it shows that whatever past we carry into this place, you can always lean into a new and more gentle future. Your past does not define who you are or who you can be. Some of you think, well, how could I ever be softer? How could I ever make it to that? What if about those of you who struggle with your tongue or your time or your temper? What about those of us who struggle with our habits or our addictions and we feel so out of control? Well, for all of you who resonate with any of that, welcome to human life. Control does not come from here. Control comes from the Spirit when we let it happen that way. And that's the list, the fruit of the Spirit. This is not a checklist of things that you are expected to do to be perfect. This is not a goal for you to accomplish. Kindness and generosity and self-control are a description of what happens when you keep turning back to the path of wholeness with the help of the Spirit. And God knows you're going to come up short on every one of them over and over. We all do. And still they are signposts for redemption and for the courage to strive for your best and your most full life. So I hope you have people who can show you these fruits, and I hope you see them once in a while, even in your own life. I hope you can celebrate them and take the time to center yourself so you might be aware of those images of love and when they are the most ripe for picking. May it be so.